In the earliest days of human society, power belonged to kings and warriors. Swords carved borders. Crowns defined nations. Armies shaped history. But buried beneath all the noise of conquering empires, a quieter force was slowly growing. Unseen, unnoticed, and underestimated. Money, not coins, not notes, but the idea of money, the invisible agreement that allowed people to trust each other, trade with each other, and build entire civilizations together. As centuries passed, rulers discovered a terrifying truth. Whoever controls money controls everything. They tried to hold on. They minted coins with their faces. They issued proclamations. They tried to command markets by royal decree. But the world was changing. Markets grew bigger than kings. Trade grew faster than armies. Commerce became more powerful than crowns. And suddenly, governments realized they were no longer in control of the very thing they depended on. The camera moves through ancient markets, medieval trade routes, the rise of early banks, and finally into the Victorian era, when the first seeds of central banking emerged. At first, these institutions looked harmless. A group of scholars, bankers, and economists working quietly, working carefully, working in the background. They promised stability. They promised order. They promised protection from financial chaos. But every promise had a price. With every market crash, governments gave central banks more power. With every crisis, they surrendered more control. With every panic, they handed over another piece of sovereignty. Until one day, they looked up and realized the guardians had become the rulers. The year is now 1913. The U.S. Congress is illuminated by flickering lamps as a bill is rushed through during the Christmas season. Few lawmakers are present. Even fewer understand what they are signing. The Federal Reserve Act passes. A new era begins. The voiceover deepens. Some revolutions are loud. Others are quiet. This one was silent. From that moment on, the global financial system would no longer be shaped by elected officials, presidents, or parliaments, but by a small circle of economists. They didn't need armies. They didn't need flags. They didn't need public approval. They had something far more powerful, the authority to create money itself. Money, an invisible force that decides who becomes rich, who becomes poor, who rises, who falls, who wins, who loses. As the documentary camera glides over decades, wars, market crashes, booms and collapses, a pattern becomes clear. Every crisis increased their power. Every disaster expanded their influence. Every problem strengthened their role. 1929, the Great Depression, central banks gained new tools. 1944, Bretton Woods, central banks gained global influence. 1971, Nixon ends the gold standard. Central banks gain unlimited freedom. Now money is no longer tied to gold. Now it can be created out of nothing. Now the world is completely dependent on those who control the supply. The narrator's voice tightens. A new form of government was born. One without elections, without campaigns, without accountability. We move into the 1980s and 1990s. Interest rates dictating entire national destinies. Currencies collapsing in Asia and Latin America. IMF and central bank interventions rewriting laws, restructuring economies, reshaping societies. Then comes the year 2008, a global financial earthquake. Governments panic, banks fail, markets collapse, and when the world calls for help, only one institution answers: central banks. They print trillions. They rescue banks. They rescue companies. They rescue countries. But a rescue is never free, because now they have crossed the line, from advisors to rulers, from regulators to architects, from background players to the main characters of global power. The narrator pauses, letting the weight of the transformation sink in. When you save the world once, the world depends on you forever. By the time 2020 arrives, the transformation is complete. COVID shatters economies. Supply chains break. Markets freeze. Governments are powerless. And so, for the first time in history, central banks take over not just finance, but almost every aspect of national survival. They decide interest rates. They decide inflation. They decide stimulus. They decide liquidity. They decide which companies live and which die. In that moment, without elections, without campaigns, without votes, central banks quietly become the real governments. The screen dims. The world map glows faintly. Invisible lines of money flow across continents like veins of a vast organism. Power didn't disappear, the voice whispers. It changed shape. For centuries, the world believed political leaders controlled nations. Presidents signed laws. Parliaments debated. Prime ministers made policy. But beneath the surface, the real machinery of power was evolving, hidden inside the vaults of central banks and the minds of those who controlled them. The story begins with crises. Crises are the fuel of institutional power. Every panic, every war, every collapse created an opportunity, and central banks took it. First came 1914, the eruption of World War I. Governments needed money, more than taxes could ever provide, more than gold reserves could support, and so they turned to their new creators of currency. Central banks printed unprecedented amounts of money for war. The message was clear. When governments need survival, they need central banks. Then came 1929, the Great Depression. Banks failed. Businesses died. Millions were jobless. Politicians were helpless. So the central banks stepped forward again, expanding monetary tools, stabilizing financial markets, and slowly making themselves indispensable. By the time World War II arrived, they were no longer helpers. They were the financial spine of modern nations. Then came the turning point of all turning points. Bretton Woods, 1944. Inside a hotel in New Hampshire, the global financial map was redrawn by a handful of men. Central bankers, finance ministers, economists. The world's currencies were tied to the US dollar. The US dollar was tied to gold. And the US Federal Reserve became the quiet center of global financial gravity. This wasn't just economic engineering. This was the birth of a global hierarchy, one where central banks formed the upper layer above governments. But everything changed in 1971. President Nixon, pressured by inflation and shrinking gold reserves, made a decision that reshaped the next century. He ended the link between the dollar and gold. Money no longer needed gold. Money no longer needed limits. Money no longer needed anything. Now it was controlled entirely by central banks. A new kind of money was born, fiat currency. Currency backed not by metal, but by trust. Trust in central bankers. And suddenly these institutions had a power that ancient kings would envy. The power to create wealth from nothing. As decades passed, central banks gained even more influence. Interest rates became their weapon. Liquidity became their shield. Bond markets became their battlefield. The narrator's tone sharpens. If you can control interest rates, you can control the cost of every home, every loan, every business, every government policy. If you can control liquidity, you can determine which industries grow and which collapse. If you can control bond markets, you can determine the fate of governments themselves. By the 1990s, a strange new reality formed. Elected leaders were temporary. Central bankers were permanent. Presidents come and go. Prime ministers rise and fall. But central bank governors stay, immune to elections, immune to public anger, protected by law, hidden behind independence. Then came 2008, the moment the mask slipped. The global financial system collapsed. Banks failed overnight. Markets lost trillions. Governments announced rescue plans. But they didn't have the money, so central banks stepped in with something radical. Quantitative easing. The printing of trillions, digitally, instantly, silently. This wasn't just intervention. This was power on a scale never seen before. Central banks began buying government debt. They began buying corporate bonds. They even began influencing stock markets. They were no longer stabilizing the system. They were directing it. This is when the world first noticed that laws didn't matter as much as liquidity. Policies didn't matter as much as interest rates. Democracy didn't matter as much as yield curves. Central banks, unelected, unseen, unchallenged, became the architects of the global economy. Then, as if scripted for maximum transformation, 2020 arrived. A pandemic freezes the world. Supply chains collapse. People lose jobs. Businesses disappear. Governments shut down entire countries. Once again, the world turns to the only force capable of stopping total collapse: central banks. This time they go beyond all previous limits. They inject trillions into markets. They fund government spending. They directly support companies. They keep entire nations alive through monetary force. Economists celebrate. Politicians praise them. But behind the applause, something historic happens. The economy becomes fully dependent on central banks. Not temporarily, not accidentally, permanently. Governments now design policies assuming central banks will print money. Corporations now make decisions assuming interest rates will stay low. Markets now behave assuming central banks will intervene during crashes. And once dependence becomes complete, power becomes absolute. The narrator continues. Throughout history, the entities that controlled survival became the rulers of society. In ancient times, it was warriors. In medieval times, it was kings. In the industrial era, it was corporations. Today, it is central banks. Because today's survival is economic survival. Control money, control governments, control credit, control companies, control liquidity, control markets, control inflation, control the people. And that is how central banks, gradually, quietly, scientifically, became the true governing force of modern life. They don't need laws, they don't need armies, they don't need elections. Their influence is invisible yet absolute. Their power is silent yet unmatched. And their decisions affect every corner of your life, from the price of bread to the cost of your home, to the strength of your currency, to the future of your nation. The middle section ends with a chilling whisper. They were created to prevent crises, but crises became their greatest source of power. The world's economy now resembles a giant machine, and at the center of that machine sits the central bank. Not by conspiracy, not by a secret plan, but by a series of crises the world was unprepared to face. The transformation is complete. But what does this mean for the future? The answer unfolds slowly, like a prophecy. 1. The consequences. For the ordinary citizen, the consequences are invisible at first. Life feels normal. Shops open, banks operate, people work, markets move. But beneath this illusion of normalcy lies a deeper truth. Your financial life is no longer controlled by your government. It is controlled by monetary forces you can't see. Interest rates decide if you can buy a home. Inflation decides how much food you can afford. Bond markets decide how much your government can spend. And central banks decide all of them. Governments that overspend get punished by the markets. Countries with unstable currencies are disciplined by higher rates. Nations that fall out of line with global banks face economic strangulation without a single shot fired. This is the new geopolitics: power through liquidity, control through currency, influence without armies. For the first time in history, financial institutions can influence nations with the press of a button, raising or lowering interest rates, injecting or cutting liquidity, shifting global capital flows overnight. It is a type of power older empires could only dream of. 2. The digital future. But the true turning point is now unfolding. The rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, a new generation of money, programmable, trackable, controllable in real time. With CBDCs, central banks can theoretically do what governments never could: track every transaction, block payments instantly, limit how money is used, freeze accounts without legal process, expire currency to force spending, control economic behavior directly. The line between economics and politics dissolves completely. For centuries, money was freedom. It was privacy. It was independence. But digital currency could turn money into a permission-based system, where your financial existence depends on the rules written by unelected officials. The narrator's tone grows colder. In the future, your wallet may belong more to the central bank than to you. And for governments, CBDCs are the perfect tool. They allow infinite spending without physical printing, direct deposits to citizens without bureaucratic delay, automatic taxation with a single code change, surveillance of capital flows with surgical precision. The world becomes more efficient, but also more controlled. 3. The new world of dependence. Companies now treat central banks as their real regulators. Stock markets rise or fall not on earnings, but on interest rate decisions. Housing markets depend on liquidity injections. Governments depend on debt buying. Global trade depends on currency stability engineered by central banks. In this new world, political leaders no longer shape economies. They react to them. They wait for central bank guidance. They adjust their policies to stay aligned. They fear markets more than elections. They fear capital flight more than voter anger. Central banks have become the quiet kings of modern civilization, ruling without ruling. They do not give orders. They give signals. They do not enforce laws. They enforce incentives. They do not speak loudly. They whisper, and the world moves. 4. The coming collision. But even this power structure has limits. For decades, central banks have used one main tool to keep the world stable: debt. Cheap debt, endless debt, global debt. Governments borrowed more. Corporations borrowed more. Consumers borrowed more. Banks borrowed more. And central banks kept interest rates low to support it all. But debt is not a river. It is a rising ocean, and the ocean is overflowing. For the first time in modern history, central banks face a paradox. To stop inflation, they must raise rates. But raising rates destroys the same debt structure they built. To keep economies alive, they must print more. But printing more risks replacing stability with chaos. No matter what they choose, the world will feel the impact. The narrator whispers, the power they use to save the world may be the same power that brings it to the edge. 5. The final message. A slow-moving shot of Earth rotates against the darkness of space. City lights glow like interconnected neurons. The narrator speaks not as a historian, not as an economist, but as a witness to a silent revolution. We live in an age where governments appear powerful, but their power is borrowed. We live in an age where markets appear free, but their freedom is crafted. We live in an age where democracy appears strong, but its foundations depend on those who print the currency. This is not a conspiracy. It is not evil. It is not benevolent. It is simply the natural evolution of power. In ancient times, power was land. Then it became industry. Then it became information. Today, and for the foreseeable future, power is money, and those who control money control the world. The final words echo over a fading musical swell. Central banks were created to stabilize nations, but in stabilizing them, they became the heart of them, the quiet governments behind the governments, the unseen authors of the world we live in. Fade to black. The final beat drops. Silence.